In the annals of World War II, there is a name that even the most brutal SS officers would whisper with disgust: Dirlewanger. This is not a story about soldiers. This is a story about how the Third Reich weaponized the dregs of society and gave them the right to be evil. To understand the existence of such a unit, we must look to its creator, a man whose very life is an indictment of moral decay, Oskar Dirlewanger. The name does not ring a bell on the great battlefields, but it is whispered with loathing in sealed records and tearful testimony. He was not a strategist, but an architect of suffering. On the surface, his path began like many others. A young volunteer in World War I, decorated with the Iron Cross for bravery, wounded many times. A hero. After the war, he even earned a PhD in political science. A scholar. An intellectual. But beneath the surface, something else was growing. He joined the Nazi Party early, a loyal old soldier. But his loyalty was not to ideology, but to the violence it sanctioned. The interwar years were a long series of drunken brawls, of unchecked aggression and animalism. And then the mask fell. In 1934, Dr. Dirlewanger, the war hero, was sentenced to 2 years in prison. His crime was not political, but a crime that exposed the rot within, the sexual abuse of an underage girl in the League of Young German Women. This was not a moment of weakness. This was the essence. Expelled from the party, stripped of all honor. For anyone else in a regime obsessed with racial and moral purity, that would have been the end. Dirlewanger would have disappeared into a prison cell and been forgotten by history. But in the Nazi war machine, nothing was useless, not even the most despicable. From the darkness of the prison, a hand reached out. Gottlob Berger, a high-ranking figure in the SS and Dirlewanger's old comrade in arms, saw a use for the monster. Berger did not see a despicable sex offender. He saw a tool. A man without moral limits, without the bonds of honor, willing to do things that even the most hardened SS would hesitate to do. Berger wrote to Heinrich Himmler, describing Dirlewanger not as a criminal, but as a, quote, original German man, whose small human weaknesses could be overlooked in the service of the greater good. A chance at rehabilitation was offered. Dirlewanger was sent to Spain, fighting in the Condor Legion. There, amid the brutality of the Civil War, he honed his killing skills. He returned not as a pariah, but as an expert in dirty warfare. But the real question remained, hanging like a dark cloud. Why did the Third Reich, a machine that preached honor and purity, need such a man? He wasn't just being spared. He was being groomed for a special mission, a mission that required a kind of cruelty the world had never seen. He wasn't just being handed a gun. He was being given an army of his own, an army recruited from the very place he had just escaped, the criminal underworld. To deal with guerrilla warfare, conventional armies were not enough. Heinrich Himmler needed a different kind of weapon, one that could operate outside all codes of honor and law. His solution was one of the regime's sickest ideas: forming an SS unit from convicted poachers, outlaws with innate skills in tracking and killing. The year is 1940. The war is widening. The Nazis need specialized units to deal with the resistance and guerrilla movements emerging in the occupied territories. This is not a frontline war, but a war in the shadows, in the forests and swamps, where the usual rules of warfare do not apply. Berger argues that the convicted poachers, the Wilddieb, possess a unique skill set. They are expert marksmen, expert trackers, with a survival instinct and a trained ruthlessness. They have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Himmler, obsessed with social experimentation and the alchemy of power, was convinced. He saw this as an opportunity to recycle the dregs of German society into useful tools for the Reich. An order was given. From prisons and concentration camps across Germany, the first men were assembled at Oranienburg. They were not soldiers, but a collection of social outcasts. The unit was officially born under the name Oranienburg Poaching Squad. Oranienburg Poaching Squad. And who better to command such a pack than its leader? Oskar Dirlewanger, with his combat experience, proven brutality, and his own criminal nature, was placed in charge. He did not command out of respect. He commanded out of an understanding of the instincts of his followers. He was the embodiment of everything they craved. A criminal given absolute power. The formation of this unit was a direct affront to the image the SS had worked so hard to cultivate. The SS saw itself as a knightly order, a racial and moral elite. But here, under their aegis, was a unit that was the antithesis of all those ideals. They didn't want pure-blood Aryan soldiers. They wanted killers. Their training focused not on military tactics but on breaking down the last moral barriers. At Sachsenhausen, these criminals were trained by terrorizing other prisoners. Discipline was maintained not by rules but by whippings and on-the-spot executions carried out by Dirlewanger himself. He was molding them in his own image. When Operation Barbarossa broke out in 1941, the need for units like Dirlewanger's skyrocketed. The poaching squad quickly expanded its recruitment criteria. It was no longer just poachers. Now the door was open to all sorts of criminals. Murderers, robbers, rapists. Those with a record of violence and depravity. Even concentration camp guards, hardened to cruelty, were transferred. The unit was renamed SS Special Kommando Dirlewanger. Sonderkommando, Special Forces, a beautiful name for a pack of demons. By early 1942, the weapon had been forged. A military unit unique in history, made up of the worst elements of society, led by a depraved man and given an unlimited license to kill. The wolves were hungry, and Heinrich Himmler pointed them east, towards the ancient forests and swamps of Belarus. Their mission was not conquest, but extermination. It was called counter-partisan operations, but those who witnessed it would call it by another name, the harvest of sorrow. Every unit of soldiers has a baptism of fire, but for the Dirlewanger Brigade, their baptism did not take place on the battlefield. It took place in nameless villages, and the holy water they used to purify the ground was gasoline and the blood of thousands of innocent people. Their battlefield was Belarus, a land of virgin forests and endless swamps, perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare. Their mission, under the beautiful name of Bandenbekämpfung, banter warfare, was not to fight a specific enemy. Their enemy was the land itself and the people who lived on it. In the Nazis' sick mindset, every villager was a potential guerrilla, every forest an enemy base. And Dirlewanger's method was not pacification, but cleansing. Their modus operandi quickly became a formula of horror, a ritual of destruction repeated over and over again across the Belarusian countryside. First, they would surround a village, often at dawn, sealing off all escape routes. Not a shot was fired, just the deadly silence of the black uniformed figures closing in. Then the entire village, men, women, old people, children, were dragged from their homes and herded into the central square or an open field. Here a cruel selection took place. The healthy, able-bodied were singled out and sent to German labor camps. These were the lucky ones. The rest, those deemed useless or potentially harmful, were herded into the largest wooden structure in the village. Often a barn, a school, or, ironically, the village church. The doors were slammed shut and bolted from the outside. And then the inferno began. Grenades were thrown through windows to create the initial chaos and carnage. Then Dirlewanger's men would pour gasoline around the base of the walls and light them. As the flames raged, turning the warehouse into a crematorium, heart-rending screams rang out from within. Anyone who tried to desperately escape through a crack or a burning wall was greeted with cold machine gun fire. For Dirlewanger's men, this was not an execution. It was a hunt. A show. Many survivors reported drinking, laughing, and eating as they listened to the screams of their victims. The numbers in their own reports tell the story. In a single operation in August 1942, the unit reported killing 557 partisans, but capturing only 259 rifles. The ratio was a written confession. They were not fighting the army, they were massacring civilians. Their marching diary recorded the destruction of dozens of villages in chilling terms. Village A, pacified. Village B no longer exists. Their brutality was so appalling that it began to cause resentment within the German military ranks. General Max von Schenkendorf, the rear commander of Army Group Center, wrote despairing reports back to Berlin, calling Dirlewanger's unit a plague and a disgrace to the German uniform, complaining that their actions were only creating more partisans. German civil administrators also complained that the wholesale slaughter of the workforce was sabotaging the Reich's economic efforts. Horrifying reports were sent back to Berlin. Wehrmacht generals begged their superiors to disband this, quote, criminal mob before it tarnished the honor of the entire army. Any other commander would have faced a court-martial, but not Oskar Dirlewanger. From Himmler's office came not a reprimand, but a compliment. Dirlewanger was promoted. The brigade was allowed to expand. Their cruelty was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. And the experiment had only just begun. For most genocide units, killing is an industrial process. But for the Dirlewanger Brigade, it became a blood sport. When the imperative to kill no longer satisfied them, they began to invent their own games, and their playground was human suffering. As the campaign in Belarus dragged on, their systematic brutality began to morph. Mass destruction was no longer enough. Dirlewanger's soldiers, given absolute power over life and death, began to invent their own games. Their morbid imaginations knew no bounds. Survivors and German military witnesses later recounted stories that would seem unbelievable were they not corroborated by countless records. They told of a winter game in which village women were forced to wade into icy water to retrieve something, and when they emerged, shivering and blue, they became walking targets. They told of Dirlewanger's own scientific experiments, where he allegedly injected strychnine or other poisons into women to observe their deathbed convulsions, taking meticulous notes, like a researcher. The accounts of deserters, such as Hubert Lea, who fled to Sweden, painted a picture of nightly orgies where Dirlewanger and his officers would personally select victims for torture and gang rape. This cruelty was ingrained in the culture of the unit. It became a secret competition, a way to prove one's worth in the eyes of the commanding officer. Who could come up with the most creative form of torture? Who could demonstrate the most complete contempt for humanity? In the town of Svislach, Jewish women were reportedly forced to dance around a bonfire made from their own clothes before being raped and killed. These acts were not random outbursts of violence. They were choreographed displays of inhumanity. And perhaps nothing reveals their true nature more than their treatment of the most vulnerable of all, children. The accounts recorded by the Soviet Extraordinary Commission on Nazi Crimes tell of the unimaginable. Soldiers competed to see who could kill the most children with a single bullet by lining them up. They used babies for bayonet practice. They threw living children into burning buildings, just to hear them cry. In the hamlet of Kozly, a survivor named Anna Lysenko testified that Dirlewanger's men gathered 26 children, shot them one by one, and forced the others to watch. The last child, a boy, was spared, not out of pity, but to be used as a human punching bag for close-quarters practice. Even a senior figure like Hermann Fegelein, Hitler's SS liaison officer and later brother-in-law, was horrified. He complained to Himmler, "Dirlewanger's men shoot children for fun. This is not fighting, this is madness." But for Himmler, this was not madness. This was efficiency. This was terror in its purest form. By 1944, the Dirlewanger Brigade, now regimental in size, had perfected the art of destruction. They were no longer a military unit. They were a walking plague, a collective of armed psychopaths. They had turned a large swath of Belarus into a graveyard. But fate was not yet done with them. As the Red Army began its counteroffensive, pushing the Germans westward, a new battlefield awaited the wolves. A city was preparing to revolt, unaware that it was about to face a nightmare worse than war. Warsaw was waiting, and the Dirlewanger Brigade was on its way. August 1944. Courage has a name, Warsaw. When the city rose, they fought for freedom. But they did not know that, to extinguish that fire, Berlin had sent more than just troops. It had sent a unit specialized in genocide and given them orders to slaughter every living thing. On August 1st, the Polish Home Army launched its uprising. Himmler, in a rage, issued one of the most brutal genocidal orders of the war. His orders to his SS commanders were clear. Every inhabitant of Warsaw must be killed. No prisoners. The city must be completely razed to the ground, as a warning to all of Europe. To carry out such an order, he needed an instrument without conscience, without limits. He called upon Oskar Dirlewanger. When the brigade arrived in Warsaw's Wola district on the 4th of August, even other SS officers were horrified. The commander of the suppression force, Heinz Reinefort, remarked, "They are not soldiers, they are a pack of wild animals pumped full of vodka." They were released with a single order, kill everyone. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. A 3-day black tie ritual, known to history as the Wola massacre. Derlewanger's men went from building to building, from basement to basement, killing everything they saw. They made no distinction between soldiers and civilians, men and women, old and young. Hospitals became slaughterhouses. At Wola Hospital, doctors, nurses, and patients were executed in their beds before setting the building on fire. At St. Lazarus Hospital, Derlewanger himself is said to have overseen the massacre, pausing only to single out young nurses for his depraved acts before killing them. Churches became execution grounds. Factories, like the Ursus factory, were turned into giant execution grounds where thousands were lined up and machine-gunned. On August 5th alone, known as Black Saturday, it is estimated that as many as 20,000 people were murdered. In total, over the course of 3 days, between 40,000 and 50,000 Polish civilians were killed in Wola. The rate of killing, carried out with machine guns, grenades, and bayonets, surpassed even the output of the gas chambers at Auschwitz at their peak. It was a firestorm of pure hatred and animalism. Wanda Lurie, a pregnant woman, miraculously survived after being shot multiple times and falling under a pile of corpses. She recounted, "They shot us. I was hit. I fell but conscious, covered by the bodies of others. I saw them kill my 3 sons before my eyes." But this barbarism was accompanied by military incompetence. When faced with armed and determined Polish resistance fighters, these butchers proved to be pathetic soldiers. They charged barricades recklessly and suffered terrible casualties. In the first 10 days in Warsaw, the brigade lost nearly half its men. They were bloodhounds, ferocious only against defenseless prey but cowering before actual wolves. The slaughter was so rampant that even those who had given the orders had to intervene, not out of compassion, but out of efficiency. SS General Erich von dem Bach-Selewski realized that Derlewanger's men were so preoccupied with satisfying their bloodlust that they had forgotten their primary mission of suppressing the uprising. The orders were changed. Women and children would be deported instead of killed on the spot. But for the 40,000 souls in Wola, the order came too late, and Derlewanger's madness was not over. Inside the unit, another rot, an internal rot, was beginning to unfold with an equally horrifying intensity. It is commonly believed that there is honor among thieves. The Derlewanger Brigade proved otherwise. Built on men who knew nothing but violence and self-interest, corruption was not just a risk, but an inevitability. The hell they brought to the outside world was in fact only the overflowing of the hell that was seething within them. Discipline in a normal military unit is built on respect, order, and common purpose. In the Derlewanger Brigade, discipline was a farce, replaced by a culture of fear, internal violence, and loosely controlled chaos. The fuel for this chaotic machine was alcohol and drugs. Reports from other units complained repeatedly that Derlewanger men seemed to be in a constant state of inebriation. They consumed 3 months' worth of schnapps in a matter of weeks. Before each campaign, they were given pervitin, a form of methamphetamine, to increase their aggression and remove their inhibitions. They did not fight with courage, they fought with chemical courage. Violence was not reserved for the enemy. Drunken brawls frequently ended in murder. Officers, encouraged by Derlewanger himself, ruled with fists and guns. Company Commander Kurt Weiser once shot 3 of his own men for falling asleep on guard duty and displayed their bodies as a warning. Derlewanger did not punish the act, but applauded it. He ruled not as a general but as a gang leader, rewarding brutality and punishing any sign of compassion, which he viewed as weakness. The unit's records show an alarmingly high number of deaths from accidents, suicides, and execution, a testament to the fact that their worst enemies were sometimes their own comrades. At the pinnacle of this corrupt system was Oskar Derlewanger himself. He was the embodiment of contradictions, a heavy drinker who maintained iron control, a coward in the face of armed enemies but a tyrant in the face of his subordinates. He would shoot a young soldier to death for refusing to join in the burning of a village, and then promote another officer for inventing a new form of torture. He created an environment where only the most brutal and cunning could survive and advance. A rotten body cannot last forever. As the Eastern Front collapsed in late 1944 and the Red Army moved in with a vengeful storm, the Derlewanger Brigade, drunk, broken, and slaughtering each other, faced a new reality. They were no longer hunters in the safety of the forest. Now they were the hunted. And for those who had caused so much suffering, the vengeance that was coming would be unforgiving. History has a cruel symmetry. For nearly 3 years, the name Dirlewanger was a death sentence for countless men. But in late 1944, as the Red Army closed in, the roles were reversed. The hunters now became the most sought-after prey on the ruins of the Eastern Front. The disintegration did not come in a grand battle, but in a chaotic series of cowardice and self-preservation. Discipline, already a laughingstock, was gone. The unit broke into small groups, ragtag bands of bandits, trying to plunder their way to survival and flee west. Non-Germans, forced into the ranks from prisons and POW camps, deserted en masse at the first opportunity. For them, surrender to the Western Allies was their only hope. Falling into the hands of the Red Army, with the reputation of the Dirlewanger Brigade, meant an instant death sentence. And the fate of the leader of the pack, Oskar Dirlewanger, became one of the most mysterious and controversial endings of the war. The official story is that he was wounded in Hungary in February 1945 and sent to Germany for treatment. On June 1, 1945, he was captured by French soldiers in the town of Altshausen, hiding in a warehouse and carrying false papers. He was imprisoned in a local prison. A few days later, on June 7th, Oskar Dirlewanger was pronounced dead. The official cause: cardiac arrest due to physical trauma. But that's not the whole story. The truth, whispered by witnesses and later corroborated by evidence, is much darker and more sinister. The prison where Dirlewanger was held was guarded by Polish soldiers from the French occupation forces. Many of them were former forced laborers or prisoners who had lost their families and homeland. Somehow, word of the new prisoner's true identity leaked out. To these Polish soldiers, the name Dirlewanger was more than just a German officer. He was the embodiment of the Wola massacre, the demon that had decimated their people. Justice was served not in a courtroom, but in the darkness of a prison cell. For several nights, Polish guards are said to have entered Dirlewanger's cell. They did not kill him immediately. They beat him slowly, paying him back, bit by bit, for the pain he had inflicted on tens of thousands. They were the ghosts of Warsaw, returned to collect. When he died, his body was a jumble of broken bones and bruised flesh. When his body was exhumed in 1960 to establish the cause of death, an autopsy confirmed evidence of a brutal beating. The leader of the monsters was dead, torn apart by the very ghosts he had created. But the demonic brigade was more than a single man. Thousands of its members had melted into the chaos of a crumbling Europe. Some died, some were captured, but many, too many, escaped. They shed their uniforms, changed their names, and disappeared into the crowd. The story of the Dirlewanger Brigade did not end with the death of its leader. Its most horrific legacy had only just begun. The collapse of the Third Reich was a perfect cover-up. Hundreds of the brigade disappeared in the chaos. Professional criminals, they were experienced in living outside the law. They changed their names, invented false stories, and assimilated into a post-war German society eager to forget the past. Allied denazification efforts, however well-meaning, could not turn over every rock to find every snake lurking beneath. And so the butchers began a new life. Heinz Barth, a member of the brigade, lived openly in East Germany for decades before his arrest in 1981. In court, he showed no remorse, coldly declaring, "I was a soldier then, and I followed orders." A more terrifying case is that of Kurt Peter Kruder. He took part in the most brutal massacres in Belarus. After the war, he became a respected police officer in Frankfurt. He brought law and order to the streets, while his hands were still stained with the blood of hundreds. It was only in 1964, when a survivor happened to recognize him during a traffic check, that his past came to light. But even then, he received only a light sentence, and after his release told the press, "The past is the past. Germany has moved forward." But most worrying of all were those who had no intention of retiring. For them, the war never ended. The brutal skills they had honed in Belarus and Warsaw became a valuable commodity in the turbulent post-war world. Dozens of former members joined the French Foreign Legion, carrying their brutality to colonial wars in Indochina and Algeria. Others became mercenaries, selling their murderous skills to dictatorships and factions in civil wars in Africa and Latin America. Friedrich Schwend, a former logistics officer for Dirlewanger, became a notorious security advisor to right-wing regimes in South America, reportedly teaching the torture techniques he had learned on the Eastern Front. Evil was not eradicated in 1945, it simply metastasized. The Derlewanger Brigade is more than a military unit, it is a warning. A terrifying testament to the fact that when a system decides that there are people who are not human, the worst of us are given the power to become evil. History has sealed their records, but the silence of the burned villages and mass graves still echoes. A whisper, reminding us that the monster is not dead. It's just sleeping,